Hi, everybody, and welcome. I am your host of Career Launch Live. Although this is not our regular Career Launch Live, we're having a special live here with Trip Odell. I just had him on the Supermania show. It was absolutely fantastic, and so we're here to talk about neurodiversity in the workplace and in education. So, Trip, start off by telling us a little bit about you and what you do. The short version, the
The
mini
short,
version.
the short version is complicated. So I was diagnosed when I was 7 with dyslexia, ADHD, all of the things basically around dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, those sorts of things back in 1979. So I grew up in the age of self-contained classes and those sorts of things. Didn't learn how to read until I was in 4th grade. And along the way, I'd used technology to meet my learning needs. So, for example, the first time I wrote with a word processor, I was accused of plagiarism when I was in high school.
Which is
So
so crazy.
yeah, and so I studied actually as a special educator, mostly in undergrad, and because of ADA wasn't in place, I wasn't allowed to graduate with an education degree because my handwritten field notes weren't neat enough. And so switched to political science because I was interested in advocacy. Still got out in 4 years,
Okay.
and then
Wow.
it ended up working on Capitol Hill for a while. Quit my job because I didn't like it, and went and taught in the Jesuit Volunteers as a volunteer teacher for 2 years, and kind of got into the technology in a big way in the classes that I was teaching. A lot of creative multimedia in the late 90s, and found I had a knack for it, and taught for a few more years. And then I went to graduate school and discovered the very beginnings of user experience and product design. And I've been in technology for about the last 20 years, and in and out of education. So I've worked in education startups. I ran K-12 at Amazon. Um, but my motivation in all of the jobs that I've taken at Adobe, Microsoft, Amazon, startups, now at Pearson, have been related to how to make it, how to empower people with technology. And
Right.
my home base has always been for people that think differently. So I've become uh, I've done a lot of speaking now as neurodiversity has become more of a thing, and our thinking is beginning to change around these differences.
And I want to just stop and kind of give people kind of a perspective. So even the term neurodiversity didn't exist until the mid 90s. And so you were diagnosed well over a decade before that. So the better part of your life, your young life was was before this was even a concept, really. And
Right.
so neurodiversity, for anyone watching who doesn't know, is it basically refers to anybody who has a diagnosable difference in terms of how their brain processes information. So that can be anything from autism or ASD to DID, Tourette's, dyslexia, all those fun things, ADHD, all those kind of fun things. So
Well,
lots of beautiful neurodiversity out there.
and I think a lot of it's driven by the pandemic, is that you're seeing a lot more diagnoses or people that are
Hmm.
self-identifying. One of the barriers for this is that people that are officially certified, like I am, they only catch about half of them. About 85% of all the children
That's true.
in education with an IEP or some sort of accommodation have dyslexia. It's by far the most common type of difference, and researchers estimate up to about 20% have it. And one of the big problems with neurodiversity, is almost always equated with autism, right?
Yes, it
Um,
is.
and and even when they do acknowledge the other areas, it's like, yeah, we're there too. And actually, like, the audience is actually much bigger than the autism community,
Yes.
even though the
Yes.
diagnoses are increasing in that area. um, and they're figuring out that there's big differences in the neurodiversity of men and women. um,
Yes.
but there's a
Very
lot
much
of
so.
research coming out and talking about the benefits of this,
Yes.
of this type of different thinking. And even when we talk about things like diagnoses, the medical model of disability, school
Hmm.
disabled me. It didn't disable my ability to learn. I don't have a learning
Right.
disability. I have a learning difference.
It wasn't, yeah, exactly. And that's one thing I keep trying to teach is that different does not equal deficit, right?
Right.
So I have a couple of different neurodiversities myself, and I'm actually going through another. diagnostic process right now. So we'll see. They might have yet another one. And all it means is that your brain processes differently. So what's really
Mhm.
interesting is that there are all kinds of sources out there, from Bureau of Labor and Statistics to the National Library of Medicine to Harvard to Yale, University of California, that are all out there talking about how these different diagnoses or conditions, or whatever terminology you want to use, come with these really cool other attributes. So, you'll have people, for instance, with dyslexia, and I believe this definitely applies to, or that have dyslexia definitely applies to you, is that they're solution finders is one of the main, and they're innovators. They tend to be innovators.
Well, yeah, 40% of the self-made millionaires in the
Yeah.
United States are dyslexic. Almost 100% of the astrophysicists are.
Hmm.
So one of the really interesting things about this is when they go through and it costs thousands of dollars to get an official, neuropsychologist, somebody with a PhD to actually diagnose
Yeah.
those differences. But what most people don't realize is it's not like, well, you have cancer, or
Oh, yeah. No.
you're paralyzed or whatever, and they know why. But with these types of differences, really all they're doing is they're doing a battery of tests to measure like your executive function for, say,
Right.
ADHD, or your sensitivity to certain things. And they're starting to be able to look in fMRIs and see the differences in the structures.
Hmm.
But these are stable characteristics. They're highly genetically heritable. And the thing that I always talk about with dyslexia is that if the estimates of 20% of the population have some degree of dyslexic processing, why is it considered a disability? I can't think of another thing that is 20% of the population has it. Uh,
Can't either.
number two, it doesn't, like, it's not a progressive thing. It's a stable difference.
Right.
And if with 20%, that is a strong indicator of a evolutionary advantage.
Absolutely.
We look at the school system. The school system, as we understand it today, hasn't changed much in 150 years, and it goes back to Prussia,
It's true.
uh,
It's true.
where they were
It's
educating
ridiculous.
factory workers, and they needed
Hmm.
everybody to be sort of standardized, trained to a
Hmm.
degree. And universal literacy is about as old, maybe a little bit less. The brain is 500,000 years old. The modern Homo sapiens brain is about 500,000 years old or older. So you got a 150-year-old system that we say, well, if you can't do this just right, you're disabled, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus something that the system is just too narrow and not tolerant enough to actually look at the diversity of ways that people learn.
Exactly. And I think, and to your point, by the way, about the evolution of the human mind. So I was reading an article by Harvard Medical School, and they were talking about the genomes that, in the human brain, that have started to help us evolve as humans, and further away from, caveman days and things like that, are directly linked to autistic or autism traits. And that's fascinating.
Well, yeah,
It's go
there's a
ahead.
there's a similarly this woman she's dyslexic, but she's also a PhD in anthropology at Cambridge, and she has this theory that's starting to gain a following around what they call complementary cognition. So what you're describing is that people who are autistic or people who are dyslexic, we have very different styles of cognition and ways of
Yes.
solving and looking at problems. Like, I'm very nonlinear. It's like a terrorism map in my head. There's no
I'm,
coincidence.
I'm the same way, but I don't think I've ever described it that way. I like
Um,
that. That's funny.
but I can jump 5 steps ahead, and it can be very frustrating. Um, but that's the reason, like, GCHQ, which is the English version of the NSA, has a unit comprised entirely of dyslexics, because we're better at mapping networks of financial crimes and terrorism cells and those sorts of things, because we make these non-intuitive leaps, and we're right very frequently. That
Right.
was one of the things at Amazon. I was told I was right a lot, and that was one of their big principles. They look for think big. They look for right a lot. These are characteristics that all tech companies look for, and they
Yes.
call these Silicon Valley diseases, sort of pejoratively,
Yeah. I've
right?
heard that for quite a while in IT recruiting. Yeah.
Right, right.
It's interesting. Oh, by the way, we had a question. Um, so it says, I have seen that people feel that it's difficult to diagnose dyslexia based on developmental milestones. For example, reversals, reading and writing may not be developmental through second grade. What do you think?
So it's a great question. One thing that a lot of people don't realize. So I grew up, I was, my university experience, I was actually, because of what happened to me, I was put on the compliance committee for ADA to write the plan for the university. So I'm very familiar with ADA, as well as IDEA and Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act.
Right.
So the legal standards. A lot of the things they say they can't diagnose dyslexia until the child should be reading, which is third grade. By third or fourth grade, if a kid isn't reading by fourth grade, the prison, the school to prison pipeline becomes more and more of a reality. But a lot of times we work on a deficit model where kids won't be diagnosable until third grade. That's changing a bit because they've been able to detect it more. But one of the things that I advise other parents is there are things that do start to show up. So maladaptive speech, like they don't quite say words, or they'll say a word that sounds similar but means something different, as a frequent pattern. It's not like you see it. You see hand dominance ambiguity. So they'll hold in their left hand and draw, and then they'll switch and they'll hold to their right hand because they don't want to cross.
That's interesting.
Well, it's one of the things they think with these differences is that the corpus callosum, which is the structure that goes down the center of the two hemispheres, which actually deals with the processing, they don't want to cross the axis of their body, right? So like they don't have the coordination to sort of cross over on the paper. So they have to, so that ambiguity of left-handed, right-handedness, and that's actually an indicator. Left-handedness is actually a strong indicator of dyslexia.
Interesting.
Well, and again, it has to do with that hemispheric dominance. So you have a right side dominant, you have a left hand bias.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there's things like that. Weak core is another. And so if you have those sorts of concerns for a younger child, at about age 3.5, you can have the child screened. You can go to your local school district. It's a legal entitlement, I think at the federal level, but in many states, you can have the child screened for what's called, they categorize, they put everything as a code, right? So it's ECD, early childhood delay, which can qualify them for earlier intervention for these types of things and give them some coping skills before they enter kindergarten. Once they enter kindergarten, they work on the deficit model. So the child has to be failing before they'll engage in some sort of intervention.
Which is so frustrating to me. Number one, because there's so many easy tools out there to help any child who has any sort of different learning ability.
Right.
I mean, everything from different styles of reading aid to different types of aids with math, different ways to learn history that involve kinesis, touch for anybody who doesn't know, visual, auditory, all of that. There's no reason to only teach one way.
Yeah. And the thing of that is, and this is, I think, what a lot of adult people with neurodiversity get frustrated with, is a lot of the attention goes on children. So, I get the thing. It's like, wow, you really overcame your dyslexia. It's like, no, I live with my dyslexia every day. It's one of the things that makes me awesome at what I do. Right. But it's also like, there are real challenges that I have to navigate. And they're afraid to disclose in the workplace or until things get critical, and then you get doubted because it's invisible. Right. So it's it makes the stigma that's, especially with things like autism, there's so many stereotypes around it. Even for people that should know better, people that have degrees in special education or whatever, there's a lot of bad information and stereotypes out there around the nature of what these things are and how to help.
It killed me when a friend of mine recently, her son was diagnosed as being autistic. And the doctor's words to her was, "I'm sorry to tell you, your son has autism." And I'm going, well, what a rude way to put that. You're not saying, "I'm sorry your kid has cancer, they might die," or, or something like that. You're just saying your child thinks differently. and
Well,
is going to process, and not just thinks, but is going to process information, is going to have different needs. That's all it is. I mean, and so when she posted about this, I saw all these people, oh, be strong, oh, all this nonsense. And I said, there will be different challenges raising him as compared to your other children. I said, but he is going to do amazing things. I said, here are, sorry, I had somebody calling in. I said, here are some articles. I said, he is going to be spectacular. He's going to have all these wonderful gifts. I said, don't worry. I said, it's different for everybody. I said, but don't worry. He's okay. I said, congratulations. You have a neurodiverse child.
well, and I'm willing to put even money that the doctor might be on the spectrum, right? Because like you see these people that are overrepresented in STEM areas, right? And people with ASD can very much see the signal and the noise. They're very good at things like programming, or they tend to be
Yes.
more than average, better at isolating like object-oriented programming or a specific discipline within medicine, right? You see,
Yes.
and doctors not terribly known for their bedside manner, right? So there's
Right.
so there's there and just giving it to you straight. So like
It's
I
true.
I have 3 children and they're all have some sort of difference, but my youngest is ASD. And that's been one of the things that we talk about, the double empathy problem, is that people with ASD communicate much better together. And I found that even in shared experience, people with dyslexia, I hire for neurodiversity in my teams, and I have people that work for me that are ASD. And we talk about these shared experiences, and you can connect in a way that so much of what comes out in the languages, I'm sorry to tell you, or even among parents, where they're heroic for having a child with a difference rather than having it be about the child and how to best suit their needs. And so much of,
Right.
especially with autism, is about making that child conform to the mold. Things like ABA, which is essentially just operant conditioning with a fancier name. So it's how you train a dog, right?
Right.
Dyslexic or autistic adults, like the groups, consider that child abuse now, and rightfully so. Like they try to force it, and it's about forcing that compliance.
It's because it's not natural. And any psychologist will tell you, anyone who understands psychology will tell you that the human mind needs to be allowed to work as it was naturally designed. Forcing it to do differently it actually does create a certain type of trauma. It's not equal. I don't want to say equal. It is different. It is different from like a something that might cause PTSD or something like that, but it is still a trauma in the brain, and it could be long standing and create very serious issues.
I mean, I would say that it's probably not dissimilar to PTSD, because you get this terrible. Like it took me decades to get over the sense of worthlessness,
Right.
and working from a deficit. And it was really as the science started to come out, becoming more knowledgeable about this. I think one of the things that yeah, I mean, I think I kind of lost the thread there, but like I think
Okay.
one of the things though is really trying to meet people where they're at. The trauma that is experienced with that, like my son who just turned 10, from age 5, he was sort of all over the place. He would become dysregulated. We had him in all sorts of therapies and OT and a bunch of other things, and really had a lot of interventions. And it was, I had to change my approach as a parent, right? I had to understand that like I could try to force him to behave in the way that I think a little boy should behave, or I can try to understand on like what's at the cause of these behaviors. It's not him,
Right.
but there's something in the environment that is intolerable, or he's got to work so hard to kind of keep it together that you just lose it, right? And
Yeah.
it's perfectly human behavior.
It's interesting, isn't it? And everybody's response to their neurodiversity is also different. So for instance, the particular types of neurodiversity I have are not things that develop until a little bit later in life, or that really manifest until later in life. Um, there are also definite mental health concerns. So, for instance, one of my neurodiversities is being bipolar 1. Well, that also has a very strong mental health aspect. But what a lot of people, that one's kind of what I call the more obvious health, mental health. But what people don't realize is that there are mental health implications for all of the neurodiversities, especially when they're treated as less than, because it creates a lot of depression, anxiety, a tremendous amount of anxiety. Almost everyone that I've encountered that's ASD, that's on the spectrum of autism, struggles with anxiety because they're constantly being told that they're weird or they're wrong or they're worried about being perceived that way. And so it's so much anxiety to try to behave in a way that's not natural for them. And
Well,
it's very stressful.
yeah, I mean, one thing like that I kind of helped me turn the corner with my son is it's almost like somebody's visiting from another planet and observing sort of or Jane Goodall among the chimps. Like he's Jane Goodall and is very clear in sort of how he thinks should go. And then he's got all these like crazy, unpredictable creatures around him that are flinging poop at each other. Like, and he doesn't understand what's going on. He can't understand, like,
Right.
is that meant to be mean or are you just sort of joking? And, like there's all these things where you can
Mhm.
see he's just trying to navigate, and the amount of stress of not being ostracized or standing out or being treated as different. He just wants to make friends.
Yeah.
And I've seen that in the self-talk that comes up, and that carries all on into adulthood. Like even about women and men, it used to be that they said that dyslexia is very rare in girls. It's like, no, they just didn't know how to recognize it. They just went
Right.
quiet. Voice became disrupted. Same thing
Hmm.
with autism. And you carry through all of those behaviors of passing um, into your adult life, and it
Yeah.
carries into the workforce as well.
It does. And I do a lot of speeches and presentations and education around uh, the best ways to hire neurodiversity, the best ways to cultivate and embrace neurodiversity in the workplace. And one of the first things that usually kind of shocks people is that a lot of these things that you've been taught that are the way to do it in terms of interviewing, like, right, if you pull up an article about how to interview, may be completely wrong for about 20 to 30% of the people you're trying to, that you're going to be interviewing. And so it's just about having to, or at least, from my perspective, it's about making options standard. So not calling it accommodations, not like, okay, we've got to do something special, but just saying, making it standard to say, what are your preferences for this? What are some tools that would be useful for you? I had somebody very specifically ask me, what are some things that I can do to be more accommodating for neurodiverse folks, and with the in-person interview. And one of the first things out of my mouth was, be okay with no contact interviews,
Mhm.
no handshake, no eye contact, no, be okay with this, be accepting of that, because for a lot of people, that's very stressful. Be okay with note taking, pacing, all of these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. In design, one of the things when I was at Amazon, we would have a portfolio review because you have to be able to present your work. But a lot of
Right.
times, um, I came up with so people would have a design exercise, and it's a whiteboard. You get an ambiguous, weird problem that you have to solve. But I took a twist on mine, and it's usually you're just talking through it with somebody. It's part of the interview just to kind of see how they solve problems.
Right.
Um, I had a thing that I called the Kobayashi Maru, which is a Star Trek reference around the unbeatable test. And it was the idea was that no matter what the candidate, you had to keep changing the criteria for success because there's a lot of ambiguity that goes into what I do in my career. Roadmaps constantly change. You hit technical hurdles or funding hurdles or timeline hurdles, and stuff gets changed on you all the time. And so injecting those sorts of changes to an absurd extent and seeing how they handle the switch up. How resilient are they? How much do they double down on what they've already said? And you'll find that the people that thrive in that are people that have had to be resilient their entire lives and try
Right.
different approaches and fail a lot. And they have a really good sense that, like, they have a clear sense of why they're doing something in the way that they're doing it, and they can explain it. I find that neurotypicals really struggle with that. And that's why I think so many people end up in startups, because you can kind of make up your own rules, and you don't
It's the
fit
best part of a
neatly.
startup. I just want to throw that out
Yeah.
real quick. That's the best part.
There's other parts to it that,
Oh yeah.
but I think, like, even with dyslexia, like, I've had feedback in annual reviews, which at Amazon, they had their leadership principles. One of them was write a lot and earns trust and all that kind of stuff. I do really well on write a lot. And I had feedback on, like, Tripp is right a lot. But he tends to argue, and he needs to be right. He needs to be convincing when he says it. And it's like, it's sort of a weird gaslighting thing of, like, no, he was totally right, and we didn't follow what he did, and it's his fault for not being more convincing when we could have been right. Right.
Wait. I feel like if you hire someone to do a job and they
Right.
tell you, hey, this is how we ought to do it, maybe listen to them. And if you don't, that might be on you.
Right.
Why
Yeah.
why was the burden of proof or why was the burden on you? I don't know, that just strikes me as kind of odd.
Well,
Trust your experts.
and I've always done best in roles that what we call 0 to 1 products. Like, it's just an idea, and we've got to actually make something that makes money out of it. I've always thrived in those sorts of products where I can wear a lot of hats. I've got a lot more autonomy to drive. I don't have somebody telling me, well, this is the proper way, and the way that we set up this template and do this document. It's like, I want to kill myself every time I run into that, because I was just like, yes. And how's that been working out for you so far? Because you hired me to come in and help disrupt or innovate. Right.
Yep.
So it's like, people want different, but they want it to be same. Right.
Yeah, and that I've run into that a lot in my career too, and it's really frustrating and makes zero sense to me. I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, so you want to change, but you don't want to change. That like, that's not really
Right.
how that
Yeah.
works.
We don't want to do anything really differently. We just want a completely different outcome, and we're going to blame you if we don't get that.
Yeah, yeah, seen it a million times. So I
Right.
want to ask you. So I mean, people hear me all the time preach about the wonders of neurodiversity in the
Mhm.
workplace. And there can be challenges, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But I want you to share, not just with dyslexia, but with some of the other neurodiversities. What are some of the particularly unique, wonderful traits that you see to the neurodiverse community?
Um, so especially in my field, where we've got to come up with, like, 3 different ways we could solve a problem and propose it and visualize it. Um, I can speak mostly to dyslexia, and some of the ADHD stuff, um, because I've seen that in effect. I can speak a little bit to the autism piece of it. I think with folks with autism, they can they can kind of cut through the BS and see
Yeah.
exactly what's happening,
Yep.
and they will say the uncomfortable truth in the room. Now, sometimes there's a lot of tone coaching that goes with that. There is a bit of
There can be. Yes.
rigidity, and you have to be careful with that, especially where you've got multiple aspects of diversity, whether it's a woman or somebody that, is a minority of some form or another, where I think we fail to realize that people bring their entire selves to work, whether they intend to or not. And if you're in a workplace where it doesn't feel safe to be yourself, that level of masking, I mean, I often equate, like, being neurodiverse to what people in the LGBT community had to go through up until about the mid 90s, and the stuff that would just fly and be okay to say. And we've come a long way there. But people would have to be very, very careful about what they shared with whom, or to have to work twice as hard at something. And if you don't feel safe like that, you're going to burn out. You're going to feel constantly exhausted. And that
Mm-hmm.
is not something that is unique to people with neurodiversity. You're seeing it with the pandemic, and
Mm-hmm.
people are putting in 10 or 20% more work for the same pay, and they're burning out. And there's a bunch of things that are going on. And we say we're blaming remote, but we haven't changed the way that we run organizations and the tool
Right.
sets that we use. So it has an impact on everyone, but the people that are different and feel stifled um, are the ones that are going to be your squeakiest wheels.
Yep.
And so I think not necessarily like as a manager, I think there's a new type of manager that is required for this phase, right? And that a lot of the research is starting to indicate. But managers that have strong emotional intelligence and are resilient, they don't, you can hear something tough from a direct, and that you have that level of trust, because you have to recognize that difference in power and the isolation and the distance that comes from it, is that you can have them say really tough things, but then try to be really active in the listening, or to at least
Right.
acknowledge it, or not just jump to a conclusion. Is like, be curious about what that person's actually going through. And that seems like really simple things, but it's not. There's not, people want to be seen as accepting, but they
Right.
never question, like, what do I not know about this? Right? What do
Right.
I can
Exactly.
just assume.
It makes me laugh because I'll have a lot of people come to me to quote ask questions about, approaching something with a diversity related issue. And then they'll go, yeah, but I do this, but I get this. I said, then why are you asking me? If you think you know everything, why are you asking me? And the
Yeah,
truth is they recognize the hole. They know it's there, but it's that back to I think we're back to I don't actually want to change. I just want to have a different result from doing the same nonsense over and
right.
over and over and over again. The main thing I've tried to get a lot of folks to kind of circle back and really understand is that a concept I learned a long time ago, and I actually just talked about this on another show, is that you should be managing equally but not the same. So people should receive equal treatment but not in the same way, because everybody needs different type of communication, needs different type of learning, different emotional needs. So you can't manage, like you and I can't be managed the same. We're both innovative, creative people who are very, very different. so so you can't manage two people the same. It's just not a thing. So as somebody who's led, what how do you maintain that sense of equality but without sameness in terms of how you relate to your different team members?
Well, I tell my directs, is like, because sometimes this comes up, and it's just like, would you prefer that I treat you equally, or would you prefer that I treat you fairly? Because it's like fairness. Um, there's a illustration that goes around in special education circles about three children trying to look over a fence, right? But one of them starting in a hole, right? Or like there's famous cartoons that kind of illustrate that thing of like this notion of like what actual equality versus equity or fairness looks like. Um, because I think you need to accommodate those differences. You need to accommodate, I mean, the same way that you need to, like, a good manager is going to accommodate a working single parent, right?
Right.
And allow maybe for some time shifting, or somebody who, you're not going to make a pregnant woman lift, in the factory, like, you put her into a supervisor
I
role, or you
hope
put her,
not. Yeah.
no, exactly. I mean, like, you have to kind of meet people where they're at. And I think there's this locked and loaded sort of like, well, this is the way to manage, or this is like, it takes a flexibility of mindset. I also think organizations are still designed around a factory model. So like
Yes, they are.
the whole on-site culture is the reason that we have on-site. Like in the 19th century, 17th or 18th and 19th century, we had people leave cottage industries and villages and move to cities to work in factories, and they had to move to the cities because the capital investments in the factory equipment were in the cities, right, close to the labor force, and they had to centralize the labor force. Now we have the internet, which was literally designed to be decentralized in case of nuclear attack, right? Which is what it goes back to. And you have these organizations that can be location independent, but we're still following the same, big meetings, and, we've got this department and that department, and we don't spend on that tool because we've already making do with this stupid ERP system that's terrible. That came from the lowest bidder. So I think like there's those sorts of choices where you kind of need to look at not just the people. We tend to look at individual performance. You actually look at the research suggests you look at the performance of teams and the
Yes.
ways that teams are integrated. Um, and that much of the invisible work of a good manager is that you're creating the conditions for success, whether that's policy, whether that's tools, whether that's team structure. And part of that is your approach to your direct reports and the creating a trusting relationship. And so what I try to do is establish I feel like strong leadership is gentle. And part of being strong and gentle is that you are not afraid of making yourself vulnerable, of not exposing your own challenges or um, your own shortcomings, or taking accountability for things when you make a mistake. And I think when I do that, when I especially talk about, I tend to talk a lot because I'm processing. It's like, raise your hand or interrupt me, because I will go and monologue because I'm just sort of processing what's in my head,
Yeah.
and I'll lose track of that. And but also not expecting them that's not an equal conversation. Interrupting the boss is something that you're not supposed to do. So how do you
Right.
build that trust and give them agency and empower them and make them feel like they're valued, and then create the right systems around them to make them more successful?
And with neuro and 100%, first of all, that's what I've seen work in my life, not just anytime I was a leader, but when I was being led, when I've, worked with leaders in different client companies. The leaders that work are the ones that create that trust, that ability to speak up, that idea that everybody has a voice. Those are the successful environments. And I think with the neurodiverse community very specifically, there's a little bit of an added component to that. You need to be willing to get the information in a way other than what you originally perceive, in a different fashion from the way that you originally perceived it would come. For instance, I talk a lot about my advisor on the ATS, Mervyn Kennedy McFoy, who's a complete brilliant human being. And I once asked him for a list of his ideas. And instead, and he is a neurodiverse male, he sent me um, these wonderful graphs and these spreadsheets. And it was so much more than what I asked for, but also, and which led us into a whole other product direction. And it was brilliant. But it also was actually a much more effective way to communicate what he needed to communicate. So I asked for it in one format. He sent it in another way that was better for him and that made more sense. And therefore, his ideas were communicated more effectively. And I think that you really need to have space for that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've done that. I've generally taken, like, okay, I'm going to take this as loose guidance, even though you told me this is precisely what you want, and I'm going to do this, right?
Right.
And oftentimes the result is better because it helps clarify my thinking. I can give you a specific example. So at Amazon, I'm actually a pretty good writer. It takes a lot of work. I use Grammarly and I transcribe my thinking and I punch it up and it's strong. But it takes a lot of work. At Amazon, they have a very writing intensive culture with their press release FAQ process. They use press release FAQ as one of the tools, and they call the working backwards process. And it's very, very effective. But one of the problems with it is everybody equates the PRFAQ with the working backwards process. And it becomes very writing intensive. And that's not very good at describing some problems. And so I found that storyboarding, and I've driven very, very significantly multi-billion-dollar solutions versus a 38-page paper versus 4
Yep.
storyboards that showed the problem and it shows the complete context. It's a better artifact for the problem we were solving, which was designing an
Yes.
economy, right? and showing how people behave in that economy. That was a big win. We did the same thing with Alexa. So it's like there are many ways to, except if you believe Father Bittinger, my biology teacher, many ways to skin a cat. But that was the dissection lab. I was doing it wrong.
I got it.
But I think giving people agency and guidance. I don't know. My father was a general in the Marines, and so a lot of what I think about organization and leading people kind of comes from. I come from a big military family, but one of the best books I've read on leadership recently is James Mattis's memoir, which is he talks about not a command and control, but a feedback and advise model.
Right.
Because if you want to scale as a leader, you need your people to be, first of all, hire people that are better than you at certain things. And then empower them to get better so that you can grow, right? And do the types of things, do the types of things you should be doing at the next level to drive your own growth. So, but he's like, he uses this tool called commander's intent, which is basically a letter that says, this is what we're going to do. And people know where their area of operation is. How they get to that goal is at their discretion. And it's just check in with me, get my feedback, but I trust you.
That's how I always tried to manage was, okay, here's the goal. Right. And if there's some things along the way that you have to do a certain way, then do it, then do it that way. Sometimes there's certain guidelines or something
usually
like that.
Involves finance.
Right. So sometimes there's something, but there does need to be the space for people to be able to think out of the box, do their own things. And that's also how you get some of the coolest ideas and directions and changes. And sometimes I think too, as a leader, you have to be willing to admit that you don't know how to teach a certain person and to reach out and get help.
Yeah. And I think like it's tricky. And that's actually gets to the problem of disclosure, of how to reach out for help. Because I think a lot of people, whether they have a diagnosis or not, documentation, like my documentation is decades out of date, right? And a lot of times with neurodiversity, they make you prove it every 3 years.
Yes, which is
at least in school.
Another level of dumb that I don't want to get into right now, but keep going.
But even knowing what to ask for, and I think like gets back to the point around organizations not being set up around, there's no sort of real like ombudsman, somebody that can be safe that isn't a manager and isn't HR, because like it or not, HR, their loyalty is to the company, not to the employee, and not necessarily to the manager, but they're going to back the manager because the manager is part of that hierarchy. So if you like, how do you get the right accommodations in the same way that you could get like an ergonomics consult? Like a lot of companies will do ergonomics consult because it reduces their insurance claims and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
We're one good class action lawsuit away from neurodiversity getting a lot bigger set of teeth.
So what I'm hearing you say is everyone starts suing. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, but I mean, kind of.
Yeah, it's like the smart companies like Microsoft are investing in this, and JP Morgan just announced that they've got a chief neurodiversity officer.
And Hewlett Packard has a wonderful program. Yeah.
Well, Bill Hewitt was dyslexic.
Yes, he was.
As was Steve Jobs, as was Steve Forbes. Like they're all like.
And I believe Richard Branson is dyslexic as well. And I know they have a whole neurodiversity program as well.
Henry Ford, Einstein, Elon Musk, like they're all different, right?
Oh yeah.
So, Bill Gates, like they're all. So I think there's a looking at that in terms of like, not just like, how do you, it's the carrots and sticks, the carrots being, man, there's so much potential and we can differentiate with different thinkers if we empower them and let them do what they do best and try to like put minimum constraints on how they operate.
Right. I love that too. And I love that a lot of these programs right now, the really successful ones, like with Hewlett Packard, they basically say, okay, here you are, you're hired to do this job. What do you need? And whatever it is that the person asks for, that's what they get. So if they need noise canceling headphones, if they need a yoga ball to bounce on, if they need a tool to help them with their writing because they have dyslexia, they're automatically provided with that, and it's considered no big deal. It's no different than saying, "Hey, can I have this pen or this
Right.
this special mouse pad for my carpal tunnels?"
Right.
You know.
Right. Well, the other thing too is that like you get into arguments of like degree of struggle. Like I run into this with like
Mm,
trying to like organization. Like I am really good at seeing the big picture and connecting the dots. I'd be a great forester. I'm not a good arborist, right? Like the
right. I
specific
gotcha.
details and connecting all those dots. I need somebody who's a better operator than I am to support my team because, and like many companies, our stuff is spread out all over our intranet and different tools, and you can't get there from here. And people are like, well, everybody struggles with that. And I was like, yes. And everybody struggles going up a mountain, but I'm sure somebody in a wheelchair probably struggles a little bit more. Right.
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a sort of a false equivalency or sort of dismissal that kind of goes with that. So I think one of the things I used to be very bullish about people disclosing. I'm less so than I used to be because if you're not sure what the company, like what you want, like you come there, you're asking for help, and it's like going to the doctor's office, and they're not trying to diagnose it. They're just saying, "Well, what do you need?" Right? You don't even know. Like it's like I can't even pronounce this drug. I can't even tell you if I need this or what I would need to do it. Right? So there's nobody to help dial you into the environment or the ways of working or anything like that. And it's not. And organizations don't deal with it proactively.
Right.
They don't make it welcoming. It's sort of like it's a secret check, in your file that nobody's allowed to know about it. It's treated with secrecy. And it's one of the reasons that I'm very, very vocal about it is that I'm trying to make it safer for other people. Like
Right.
I flew under the radar for a long time. It was more of a hindrance than anything else. And I now have the work resume to say, yeah, but here's your evidence on like, this is
Yeah.
what happened.
So don't worry about it.
This is what I can do. Right.
Right.
So I'm speaking from a position of privilege, but somebody who's just starting out being believed is the hardest part.
It is. And I see it all the time with these job seekers. I have a lot of people reach out and they're very frustrated. They're very scared. I've spoken to people who've already lost jobs and are very, very young. By the way, like we're talking early to mid 20s, and they've already lost a couple of jobs because they told them that they were neurodiverse. They didn't understand. They got fired. And people always say things like, oh, well, there's laws in place. Okay, but there's
Prove it.
also, yeah,
Yeah.
prove it. And yeah, prove that that's why they fired you. And let me tell you from personal experience that companies are very sneaky sometimes with how they find ways to get rid of you. Um, I, I've told a story before. There was one time when I talked about my condition, and all of a sudden, this person who had nothing but rave reviews and nothing but positivity had already gotten a raise in less than a year, only a few months, and only like 6 months in. I had all of a sudden, I was written up, deemed completely untrustworthy, and fired within
Mhm.
weeks of having telling them this. And by the way, nothing in my performance changed, nothing at all. And everybody that worked with me was going, "What?
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about?" It does happen. So like you, while I'm all about, yeah, tell them, tell them, tell them, tell them, and I still regret nothing, no regrets on that. Um, it's, I get it. I get why people don't tell them because you would need to put food on your table. And if you're not at the point of your career that you are, or even I guess that I am, then you can't prove it too. So it's kind of
Yeah.
scary.
Well, I mean, I mean, I've had similar experiences and, it's like um, I don't know. I think if you're any damn good and you're principled as a person, there's a few red badges of courage of
Yeah.
places you got canned from for doing the
Hmm.
right thing. And
Yep.
I certainly have a couple of those, and some of them probably were related to the neurodiversity, but not really. I think there's a thing where you're trying to stand up and do the right thing,
Hmm.
and you get dinged for it,
Yep.
and there's a lot of constructive dismissal that goes out there, and it's really, really hard to prove.
It is. It is. And even down to, I tell everybody the best reason to be fired is for integrity. You have the integrity and they don't. That's the best reason in the world to get fired. Um,
Does it? They don't have unfortunately, they don't have a field for that on the unemployment.
they don't, but they
Schedule,
should.
right? It's
Side
like
note, government, get it together.
I have a conscience,
Yeah,
right?
I don't suck like this company.
Right,
Okay.
right,
Um,
right.
so as we kind of wind down, Trip, I would love to get your thoughts about resources because I get asked about resources a lot.
Mhm.
So specifically, you can do specifically for dyslexia. You could give others, but what are some specific resources that you would tell folks in the employment world of employment to seek?
It's funny. I mean, in the same way that I used audiobooks and a bunch of other stuff, I usually use a lot of things. I didn't realize there'd be homework. So I have actually a whole list of things that I've done that I
Sorry.
think, um, and maybe I can follow up with an email or something. But I think I look. It's kind of understanding and thinking really deeply about what how does your brain work? Like, how do you organize? So, for example, like, they'll try to get me on Jira, and I hate Jira because it's not even the trees, it's the pine cones
Right.
on the fourth floor.
Right.
I prefer Trello, where I can put like all of the related things that I'm connecting dots to in one. Like, this is one problem. The rest of it is ice cubes on the iceberg, right?
Right.
So, figuring out what's the organizational system that works for you, and how could you make that play nicely within the workplace, and who's going to pay for it.
Yes.
Things like Descript, which is a machine learning driven audio. It's actually a video editor, but it will transcribe your stuff. So if I have to write something long form, I can riff into that, take the full transcript, drop it into Grammarly for my writing,
Yep.
and punch it up so that it's like New York Times quality. And I think visual tools like Miro or Mural, the interactive whiteboards, like, how do I organize my thinking? Does it all need to be in a straight line? Um, the answer is no for me. Like,
No.
you force me to put it into a straight line, I'm like, this is terrible. So I think it's understanding, like, doing a little bit of research on the things that are hard tend to be hard for people. So,
Yes.
I'm very good at visualization and dot connecting and telling stories or whatever, organizing and creating semantic hierarchies and all that kind of stuff. Not my thing. I'd rather have somebody help me with that. So it's like figuring out what works for you, and then what's really hard that everybody has to do. And then
Right.
figuring out, would noise canceling headphones help? Would being able to shift my hours, like if I'm bipolar, is it,
Right.
able to, like, I'm not great in the mornings. I'm going to start at noon and I'm going to work till 8
Right.
p.m. Right? Like
Have
those.
grounding tools. Like I have grounding tools all surrounding my desk where I can do grounding exercises,
Right.
note-taking apps, all of that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there's any number of ways to do it. You just have to figure out the organizational system that works for you, the communication systems that work for you. And there's lots of great tools out there, but again, I didn't know there'd be homework. I could
Sorry.
pass some.
I'm known to do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. But even things like dictation, like a
Yes.
like a comfortable headset, or, a boom mic, or, whatever. It's hundreds of dollars, but think about the tens of thousands of dollars that you have in attrition, right?
Right.
Tens of thousands of dollars in invisible work that has to be done that makes your teams less efficient. It's just
Right.
like, when you look at the opportunity costs versus the direct costs, like, it's a no-brainer from a business perspective. So smart business leaders
100%.
should be looking at that.
Absolutely. And and the way that you present it, by the way, folks, because people always ask me, how do I present my request? List out what you need and how it will help you to be more efficient and effective. That's the best way to present it. And So with that, and there's
Well,
of course
one
other fun things too, but we need,
one
okay.
one thing, one pointer on that is like if what you're proposing, like the legal standard is reasonable accommodation,
Mhm.
and don't assume positive intent. Just document everything, keep the emails, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Be very specific. But then it's sort of the onus is on the employer to describe why that's not a reasonable request. And
Right.
if they just shut you down, then there's escalation paths both inside
Right.
and outside the company.
And I always say email everything and BCC your personal email. It works. You don't necessarily have to say reasonable accommodation anywhere, but it also does not hurt.
Right.
Some people are a little dense, and so you have to kind of help them out. So with that, I want to thank you, Trip. Everybody, thank you so very much for joining me yet again at a relatively close to your our first talk. Everybody, feel free to connect with Trip. I'm going to also do a few posts surrounding this with some awesome quotes that he gave us and ideas. Please connect with him on LinkedIn. Also, check out my tip for you is to check out the Octopus movement. And that's a great movement for neurodiversity and nonlinear thinking.
Perry's great.
Perry is great. He is wonderful. This is him. Just so if you want to look him up too, this is Perry. So you can go find him as well. So thank you, Trip, again.
Thank
And I'm
you.
sure I'll have you on soon.
Okay, talk to you later.
All right, bye.